When he first ran off to fight Hitler, Alvin imagined that the quickest way to see action would be aboard one of the Canadian destroyers that were protecting the merchant marine ships carrying supplies to Great Britain. Stories in the newspaper regularly reported the sinking by German submarines of one or more of the Canadian ships in the North Atlantic, sometimes as close to the mainland as the coastal fishing waters of Newfoundland. An especially ominous development for the British, because Canada had become virtually their only source of arms, food, medicine, and machinery once the Lindbergh administration overturned the aid legislation enacted by the Roosevelt Congress. In Montreal, Alvin met a young American defector who told him to forget about the Navy. It was the Canadian commandos who were in the thick of things, carrying out nighttime raids on the Nazi-occupied continent, sabotaging utilities vital to the Germans, blowing up ammunition arsenals, and alongside British commandos and in concert with underground European resistance movements, destroying dock and shipyard facilities up and down the coastline of Western Europe. When he recounted it for Alvin, all the many ways the commandos taught you to kill a man, Alvin dropped his original plans and went to join up. Like the rest of the Canadian Armed Forces, the commandos were eager to accept qualified American citizens into their ranks, and so, after 16 weeks of training, Alvin was assigned to an active commando unit and shipped to a secret staging area in the British Isles, and that was when we heard him finally receiving a six-word letter that read, "Off to fight. See you soon." It was just days after Sandy, all on his own, took the overnight train to Kentucky that my parents received a second letter, this one not from Alvin but from the War Department in Ottawa, advising Alvin's designated next of kin that their nephew had been wounded in action and was in a convalescent hospital in Dorset, England. After the dinner dishes were cleared that night, my mother sat back at the kitchen table with a fountain pen and the box of monogrammed stationery reserved for important correspondence. My father seated himself across from her, and I stood looking over her shoulder to observe how her cursive script uniformly unfurled because of the handwriting mechanics she'd employed as a secretary and taught early on to Sandy and me, the third and fourth fingers positioned to support the hand, and the forefinger nearer the pen point than the thumb. She spoke each sentence aloud before writing it down in case my father wanted to change or add anything. "Dearest Alvin, this morning we received a letter from the Canadian government telling us that you were wounded in action and that you were in a hospital in England. The letter contained nothing more specific than a mailing address for you. Right now we are at the kitchen table, Uncle Herman, Philip, and Aunt Bess. We all want to know everything about your condition. Sandy is away for the summer, but we'll write him about you immediately. Is there any chance you will be sent back to Canada? If so, we would drive there to see you. In the meantime, we send our love and hope you will write us from England. Please write or ask someone to write for you. Whatever you want us to do, we will do. Again, we love you and miss you." To this message, we appended our 3 signatures. It was nearly a month before we got a response. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Roth, Corporal Alvin Roth received your letter of July 5. I am the senior nurse on his unit, and I read the letter to him several times to be sure he understood who it was from and what it said. Right now, Corporal Roth is not communicative. He lost his left leg below the knee and was seriously wounded in his right foot. The right foot is healing, and that wound should not leave him impaired. When his left leg is ready, he will be fitted with a prosthesis and taught to walk with it. This is a dark moment for Corporal Roth, but I wish to assure you that in time he should be able to resume his life as a civilian with no significant physical problems. This hospital is limited to amputees and burned cases. I have seen many men undergo the same psychological difficulties as Corporal Roth, but most of them come through, and I strongly believe that Corporal Roth will too. Sincerely, Lieutenant A.F. Cooper." Once a week, Sandy wrote saying he was fine and reporting how hot it was in Kentucky, and concluding with a sentence about life on the farm, something like, "There's a bumper crop of blackberries," or "The steer are being driven crazy by flies," or "Today they're cutting alfalfa," or "topping beans," whatever that might mean. Then, below his signature, and perhaps to prove to his father that he had stamina enough to do his artwork, even after working all day on the farm, he'd sketch a picture of a pig. "This pig," he noted, "weighs over 300 pounds. Or a dog, Susie, Orrin's dog, her specialty is scaring snakes. Or a lamb. Mrs. Mawhinney took 30 lambs to the stockyards yesterday, or Mr. Mawhinney took 30 lambs to the stockyards yesterday, or a barn. They have just painted this place with creosote. P.U. Usually far more space was taken up by the drawing than by the message, and to my mother's chagrin, the questions she would raise in her own weekly letter, asking if he needed clothes or medicine or money, rarely got answered. Of course, I knew my mother cared for each of her children with equal devotion, but not till Sandy was gone to Kentucky did I learn how much he meant to her as someone distinct from his little brother. Though she wasn't about to grow despondent over being separated for 8 weeks from a son already 13, all summer long there was an undercurrent of the forlorn noticeable in certain gestures and facial expressions, particularly at the kitchen table, when the fourth chair drawn up for dinner remained empty night after night. Aunt Evelyn was with us when we went to Penn Station to pick Sandy up on the late August Saturday that he arrived back in Newark. She was the last one my father wanted coming along, but just as when, against his own inclinations, he'd eventually allowed Sandy to apply for Just Folks and accept the summer job in Kentucky, he had yielded to his sister-in-law's influence over his son to avoid making more difficult a predicament whose ultimate danger still wasn't entirely clear. At the station, Aunt Evelyn was the first of us to recognize Sandy when he stepped from the train onto the platform, some 10 pounds heavier than when he'd left, and his brown hair blondish from working in the fields under the summer sun. He'd grown a couple of inches as well, so that his pants were now nowhere near his shoe-tops, and altogether my impression was of my brother in disguise. "Hi, farmer," Aunt Evelyn called. "Over here." And Sandy came loping in our direction, swinging his bags at his sides and sporting an outdoorsy new walk to go with his new physique. "Welcome home, stranger," my mother said, and, with the air of a young girl, happily threw her arms around his neck, and the words she murmured in his ear, "Was there ever a boy so handsome?" caused him to complain, "Ma, cut it out!" which, of course, handed the rest of the family a big laugh. We all hugged him, and standing beside the train he'd boarded 750 miles away, he flexed his biceps so I could feel them. In the car, when he began answering our questions, we heard how husky his voice had become, and we heard for the first time the drawl and twang. Aunt Evelyn was triumphant. Sandy talked about the last job he'd had out in the fields, going around with Orrin, one of the Mawhinney's sons, picking up the tobacco leaves broken off during harvesting. They were usually the lowest on the plant, Sandy said. They were called flyings, and it so happened they were top-grade tobacco and fetched the highest price at the market. But the men doing the cutting on the tobacco plant of 25 acres can't bother about the leaves on the ground, he told us, so they have to cut some 3,000 sticks of tobacco a day, as they have to cut some 300 sticks of tobacco a day in order to get everything housed in the curing barn in 2 weeks. "Whoa, what's a stick, dear?" Aunt Evelyn asked, and gladly he obliged her with the lengthiest possible explanation. "And so what's a curing barn?" she asked. "What's topping? What's suckering? What's worming?" And the more questions Aunt Evelyn came up with, the more authoritative Sandy became, so that even when we got to Summit Avenue and my father pulled the car into the alleyway, he was still going on about raising tobacco, as though expecting us to head right for the backyard and start preparing the weedy patch of dirt next to the garbage cans for Newark's first crop ever of white burley. "It's the sweetest burley in Lucky's," he informed us, "that gives him the taste," and meanwhile I was itching to feel his biceps again, which to me were no less extraordinary than the regional accent. If that's what it was, he said "cain't" for can't, and remember for remember, and far for fire, and agin for again, and a walkin' and a talkin' for walking and talking, and whatever you wanted to call it, that concoction of English, it wasn't what we natives of New Jersey spoke. Aunt Evelyn was triumphant, but my father was stymied, said almost nothing, and at the dinner table that evening looked especially glum when Sandy got around to reporting on what a paragon Mr. Mawhinney was. First off, Mr. Mawhinney had graduated from the College of Agriculture at the University of Kentucky, while my father, like most other Newark slum children before the World War, hadn't been educated beyond the 8th grade. Mr. Mawhinney owned Not just one farm, but three, the lesser two rented to tenants. Land that had been in his family going back nearly to the days of Daniel Boone, and my father owned nothing more impressive than a 6-year-old car. Mr. Mawhinney could saddle a horse, drive a tractor, operate a thresher, ride a fertilizer drill, work a field as easily as a team of mules, as with a team of oxen. He could rotate crops and manage hired men, both white and Negro. He could repair tools, sharpen plow points and motors, put up fences, string barbed wire, raise chickens, dip sheep, dehorn cattle, slaughter pigs, smoke bacon, sugar cure ham, and he raised watermelons that were the sweetest and juiciest Sandy had ever eaten. By cultivating tobacco, corn, and potatoes, Mr. Mawhinney was able to make a living right out of the earth. And then, at Sunday dinner, where the 6'3", 200